uh, I guess was because of a friend that I had that went to the same high school that I did. He had a grandfather who lived in Canaan Valley, Mr. Rosenblatt. Mr. Rosenblatt had a health condition. He also had a lack of labor, so on and so forth. And Herbie and I came up to visit with him one summer and to give him a hand. Mr. Rosenblatt was the kind of fellow that did things like they did about 50 years ago. Everything was hand labor. His cows were hand milked. He didn't have any hay equipment. Everything was done with a fork and so on and so forth. The old, real heavy labor business. Anyway, we did come up, and while I was here, Joe Brown, a local cattle dealer, came up to visit Mr. Rosenblatt, and the next one that came along was Joe Brown's daughter, Esther. Esther and I became acquainted, and then we became better acquainted, and eventually that was really one of the reasons for moving up. Going to Cornell and going to the agricultural school required what they call farm practice. And one of the reasons for my coming up was to satisfy that farm practice requirement also.
Now, you said you were a Bronx boy. The Bronx was still a city 50 years ago, was it not? I mean, how did you settle on farming, or did you settle on farming when you were a young man as something that you wanted to pursue?
Well, when I was, as you say, my early teens, I thought that I would like to eventually find myself in a job that kept me outside. And I did go down to the employment agency in Lowell, New York, and I told them that I would like to get on a farm, and asked them if they had any opportunities for a kid that didn't know anything about farming to get onto a farm. And first they said, "What are you, nuts or something?" And then they sent me out to a farmer, very nice guy in Canastota, New York, a fellow by the name of R. Williams. And I spent the summer there, which was very nice, very satisfactory. We seemed to like each other, and worked all summer, and supposedly just for my board and keep. But at the end of the summer, he says, "Gee, you did pretty well." And he gave me $15, which was great. It almost paid for my trip back and forth.
What time frame are we talking about here?
Oh, we're talking 1937, 38. No, I guess, wait a minute, a little bit later than that, probably 1939.
So you came up to Canaan maybe in the early 40s?
I came up to Canaan originally 43, 44.
And did you serve in the war?
Yeah.
So your time here was interrupted by military service?
No, I'm sorry, I got my dates mixed up now. I was up here, it was right after the war, 46, 47. Okay. I was in the service from 43 to 46. And it was my college career that I had 1 year in school, then off to the war for 3.
And then came back?
And then came back and went back to college. I was in between the first time that I came up here.
Now, you went to Cornell, and what kind of studies were they offering back in the early 40s for farming? I know it's gotten to be kind of a high-tech business now, but what was it like back then?
It really, Cornell is a large university, and you can do most anything you want. I never expected, truly, that I would be able to, quote, buy into agriculture because of the expense. So I studied pretty much in the field of genetics, physiology, reproduction, and when the opportunity came, of course, then I did get into farming. But, the agricultural college really was, you could go anywhere. You could go from specifically into farming or into any of the fields that, biology, zoology.
They were actually playing with genetics and the reproductive capacity of the animals at that point?
Right, absolutely. Oh, yeah.
Somehow I always think of that as a later development.
Oh no, they had been doing research, of course, at the college. There was some research in genetics. A lot of it was done with, these Drosophila flies and such. And originally that was my thought, that I'd probably get into either research, or I did apply to the veterinary school, but my Army sojourn kind of changed that around.
Cut that up a little bit. So you had a connection with Canaan, and you had a connection with Esther, and that kind of drew you back in this direction after
Of course,
graduation.
the connection with Esther was a little stronger than the connection with Canaan at that point.
But she was centered here, so obviously you
Right.
go east, young man.
Well, Esther was going to Yukon at the time, and we corresponded back and forth. And in fact, our graduations did not really coincide. She graduated before I did, because of the 3-year difference again, because of the war. And then she came up to Cornell with me for the last 6 months. Then when I graduated, we came back, and I worked at her father's farm for a while. And this brings us up to the spring of 1949, when a farm in Canaan Valley that was owned by Charlie Hoffman became available. And we moved on to that farm, bought the cows, bought some of the equipment, and rented the farm, which was really when we started farming on our own.
How big was that farm at the time you rented?
It was a fairly large farm. It had a lot of land, but not very much tillable land. We bought 27 cows, we bought a tractor, we bought a manure spreader, there was a little hay in the barn, some silage in the silo, and in fact, as I recall, the farm was kind of a wet place. Not the ideal farming situation, but we made do. Between the cows, the equipment, the whole business, it was $8,000.
Wow.
$4,000 I borrowed from my mother, $4,000 we borrowed from Joe Brown, and we were in business.
And now, just to put that in perspective, what would a young man or woman have to come up with in terms of capital now to go into business in farming with a comparable setup?
Probably the very least would be $250,000, and if you're going for really purchase of land, let's talk about a 100-cow farm, which today is more the usual. You're probably approaching more $500,000 than you are $250,000.
Now, this is a little hard to do, but with 27 cows in 1940, what kind of production levels would you have expected to have in order to be profitable?
Well, at that time, the average cow was probably making 12,000 pounds of milk.
And what would her sister of today do?
Well, her sister today probably would be 18,000. I'm not talking very, very high production. I'm talking just
normal
average
production.
Sort of production.
So we're getting 6,000 more per annum, are we talking?
Yeah,
okay.
Absolutely.
Now, why is a cow today able to produce that much more?
Well, I'd like to say because we really did a job of increasing the breed efficiency, so on and so forth, but really we feed them a lot better. That's probably the major reason. We just simply know how to take care of an animal better, how to feed them better, how to make them more comfortable. And
you think cows today are more comfortable than cows in the past, when they used to be put in a real pasture and allowed to lay in grass rather than on a cement cow
Are you an
powder?
animal rightist?
No, but I like cows on green grass, I have to say.
So do I. Unfortunately, a cow on green grass is not a very efficient animal. They waste a lot of the green grass, and we find that if we harvest the equipment or harvest the crops and then give it to them, why, we all make out much better.
So you get more efficient yield off of the land per acre and more efficient from the cow per animal all the way around.
Yeah, absolutely. We keep better control of them. less parasite problems, the whole bit. But they really are just much more efficient in the use of the stuff that we feed them.
Are you still importing, let me see, last time I talked to people, it was a long time ago, beets? They were beet pulp?
Yes. Unfortunately, though, a lot of other people have found out that beet pulp is a good crop. And in fact, a lot of beet pulp now goes to the European common nations, simply because it's, again, transporting the stuff via a ship is much more efficient than putting it on a railroad car, sending it up here cheaper. And so they can afford to buy it there, and a lot of it goes.
Now that's a crop that's from the southern states, right?
Beet pulp, citrus pulp, now cottonseed meal we're using a lot of.
So are New England farmers then becoming dependent on crops that are produced hundreds of miles away, or are we still able to sustain our herds on our own land?
Well, we never have really sustained our herds on our own land as far as the concentrate ingredients. We use a lot of corn, we use wheat midge, we use a lot of the byproduct feeds that in bread making, wheat midge, rye flours, this type of thing. The stuff that human beings can't eat many times, cows with their peculiar digestive systems can utilize. And so we make use of those feeds.
So we're becoming more like the Indians who used every part of everything.
Well,
if a human can't digest it, feed it to a cow.
That's absolutely true.
That's good. That's really good. Looking back now, you came up here just about the point where my memory kicks in. I was born in '47, and I can remember back into the early '50s. And of course, my Uncle Ben was a farmer, so some of those memories are farms. Contrast that kind of farming experience with what you're doing today, if you can.
Well, I guess maybe, there's many different ways we could explore this. It seems as though there was a little more time back then than there is now. Things were not quite so imperative that everything has to be done. Maybe even we had a little more time for family life, this kind of thing. You had a fellow walk down the road that was looking for work, or a city cousin who was maybe getting into a little someone's hair that he shouldn't have, so they ship him out to the farm for the summer. And, you could give him a hay fork, you could give him a shovel, and you could give him something to do. Today, you can't do that. Everything is very sophisticated. The equipment that we use, even in the milking parlor, very sophisticated setups. We have machines that sense when they're done milking to be detached automatically. We have systems where they flush themselves, wash themselves. We're coming to systems now where there's identification processes. A cow walks into a parlor, there's a readout station that tells you what her identification is, what her number is, the production that she gave the last 2 or 3 times, whatever you want to recall. If her production today is 10% or so, whatever you want to set, lower or higher than her production was the other day, it will flash a warning. We have a little sensor on the milk tube that tells you if her temperature is over a certain normal temperature, and that, of course, signals that there's a problem. They say that they now even count the steps that a cow takes during the day, so that if she is in heat, if she's ready to be bred, that's an indication that...
That's amazing. She's pacing the floor, literally.
Absolutely. I'll leave the rest of that to your imagination. But,
I'm so glad they don't have anything like that for humans.
Well, There may soon be. But truly, we're, you know, where we used to clean the barn with a shovel, now we use a skid steer, or we have alley scrapers.
Mm-hmm.
And we have, what I'm trying to get to, Kathy, is that we have the type of equipment that needs very knowledgeable people,
Mm-hmm.
that you just simply cannot do with the type of guy who's just walking along and wants to do a little work. And it's unfortunate. You simply have to have people that know what they're doing. You have to be very careful.
Literally requires college education at this point.
Well,
does it not?
college education, or, well, yes, most of the kids, many of the meetings I go to, the young people that are there, my own two sons, have been through college. Business management
Do you have a computer
is
in the...
mandatory.
You must have a computer at the farm.
Well, there's one computer that helps feed the cows. There's a mixer wagon that really is a miniature computer in itself. And then Ben, who is our bookkeeper, has two other computers in the office. And he regularly, we sit down for our monthly meetings, and he generates a cash flow statement. He has all of that information for us so that we are better able to make decisions that have to be made on the farm.
It's absolutely mind-boggling, and the thought of where it's going to go is even more. I mean, you get into the genetic engineering that they're doing with cows now, where you can have an embryo from a high-quality animal implanted in a great animal, so that cow produces offspring that has nothing to do genetically with her. That's really
that's right.
Amazing stuff when you stop to think about it. Have you ever done any of that kind of thing?
We have not done embryo transplants, but of course, you know, that's one of the things for us in the future. But many of the people that I'm associated with have done them. And of course, we benefit by their having gone into that.
How do you do that?
Well, through artificial insemination. We do have access to the bulls that are a product of this.
Is it cost effective at this point, or is it
yes,
still
absolutely. When you have a real top cow, and instead of having one calf per year, you can get a dozen or more than that, because when they flush a cow and they get the eggs out, they sometimes can get more than one egg. And then that, of course, is implanted into an animal, any animal that will accept the egg and grow the heifer. Why? You're just going ahead so much faster than you could with just the,
Do you foresee this eventually improving the whole range of stock, or will there still be great animals? Are we all going to have all chiefs and no Indians?
Well, you say a great animal. Really, a great animal simply is an animal that is not registered. We have a great herd, but every animal that we have in the herd really and truly is purebred, except that we have neglected to get the paperwork on them. So that, yes, absolutely,
Let's shift the subject.
We're there, really.
Let's shift the subject just a hair and talk about the product that these animals are producing. In the old days, when Aunt Lotta had her farm, her major pride was the amount of cream that was in that milk, because it was so rich and really luxurious, if I remember it properly. Now we produce a much lower fat content in milk, and we remove the rest of it for those of us who can't afford to gain too much weight. What's happening on that level now? Is that still the norm? Are we still looking for a lower fat content in milk, or is it shifting, or how's it going?
Well, what we're doing, I do sit on the Hood board, the Hood Milk Company, and so this really comes right back to many of the discussions we've had as that business entity sees it. They sell much, much more of the low-fat product. And in fact, that is the direction that they're going in, the low-fat or the no-fat, where they take out all of the fat entirely.
Blue milk.
Cows don't know that. And cows are still producing about the same butterfat as they were before. One of the things that we have been trying to do, in fact, I've been on many committees that have been trying to influence breed associations, and we're getting there, to dwell on the protein content of milk, the solids non-fat part of the milk rather than the fat. They're sort of hooked together though, and when you have a cow that's giving high protein, which is what you want in the making of cheese, so on and so forth, probably you're also getting a little more butterfat along with that. The thing is, through the proper and a long enough time given over to that, we can probably begin to raise the protein and lower butterfat, but there really hasn't been the emphasis put on that. That there should be. But we are heading in that direction. In this business of paying farmers for the type of milk they produce, there's always been what they call a differential payment. And I don't know if you don't want me to get this exotic.
No, I think we have to touch on how farmers are paid, because it's a huge issue. With this differential, farmers are paid on a sort of a double basis. One, for the amount of milk they produce, and then secondly, for the amount of butterfat that's in that milk. And what we're trying to do is to change the emphasis from the butterfat in the milk to the solids non-fat that's in the milk, and pointedly going at the protein part of it. So that, hopefully then the breed associations will begin to pick that up and concentrate more on getting a cow that will produce higher protein, lower butterfat. Okay. Now, I've heard a lot of discussion about how it's impossible for a farmer right now to produce milk on a profitable basis because of the cost of producing a pound of milk as compared to what you get reimbursed for that. Talk to me a little bit about the pressures that farmers are facing and what you see as potential answers.
Well, the pressures, as you put it very well, the pressures are simply that the costs of production have not gone down. In fact, they've gone up, and yet the price that farmers are getting for their product has gone down. Very simply, it's all tied up with the support price that the government pays for butter, powder, cheese. This is the type of thing that flows into Commodity Credit Corporation, and it's spearheaded by what the cost of cheese is in Wisconsin.
Well,
this whole pricing thing is a very complex issue. Nobody wants to pay more for food than they have to. And as farmers diminish in number, our political clout goes down. As our political clout has gone down, we more or less have become the victims of governmental policies which really are a cheap food policy. Not saying whether that's right, wrong, or indifferent. This is just the situation that we're faced with.
Seems to me like what they're doing is they're essentially saying to the farmer, produce inexpensively, let the consumer buy as inexpensively as possible, but there's a middle market there that is absorbing a good deal of the whatever profit there is. Not the farmer who's out there at 4 o'clock in the morning, and not the consumer necessarily, but the middleman, as I understand it, is the uncontrolled partner in this group.
Well, our price is controlled, right? I mean, the only way that we can influence the price that we get is through a premium structure. The only way we can do that is by banding together and getting stronger in a marketing effort. This we have never been able to do. Farmers just simply, we're all individuals and we don't cooperate together enough to really do a good job of marketing. We send the milk to a processor, such as Hood or Gorelick or whomever. They take the milk then and do whatever they have to do to it, make cheese, butter, so on and so forth. It's sent to a retail outlet, and that retail outlet, the middleman that you speak of, can charge whatever the market will bear. and they do.
Mm-hmm.
Many times the public think of the farmer as getting the benefit of the prices that are paid in the supermarket, and actually that is not the case at all.
What kind of solution do you see to that problem?
Well, the solution, I think, is where people who produce a product get together, band together, and simply say, hey, we are a marketing force that has to be dealt with. We try to do that, and dairy farmers in particular probably have done a better job than many other commodity groups in that they do have cooperatives, such as in this area we have a strong cooperative, Agrimark. The problem is that there are many other cooperatives, and we're just a small voice here in the Northeast. And we still have not learned, as I said before.
So the cooperatives are going to have to network with the bigger cooperatives.
Or network together, right, and into some sort of marketing endeavors that are
Let's
stronger.
break here and stop this background noise if we can.
You're on.
Now, a couple of years ago, I had the pleasure and the unhappy experience at the same time of riding down through the southern part of the state. And after enjoying the seashore and looking at old homes and riding along in the spring sunshine, all of a sudden I realized I hadn't seen a farm anywhere. Hadn't seen a cow, hadn't seen a barn, other than something that was a kind of an artifact. And that kind of took me back, even though I've read the statistics about farms and what's happening. What would you think is a critical mass here in New England? How deep can that go before we are really in trouble?
Unfortunately, Kathy, I think we've already reached that point and maybe gone beyond it a little bit. There used to be a lot of chicken farms up on the other end of the state. When we started farming, when I started farming, it was actually 1949 when we started shipping milk. There were 4,900 registered dairy farms.
Wow, that many.
In the state of Connecticut. That's people who were registered with the state to sell milk. Today there are less than 300 dairy farms.
That's an incredible
in Connecticut.
figure.
One of the offshoots of that, of course, well, there's several offshoots of that. Services. Farming cannot exist without the proper services. When you do not have enough farms to really support businesses, I'm talking about tractor companies, grain companies, you simply pay more for those services. They have to come from further away. When I started farming, we had, well, let's see, Charlie Wickwire was in business. He was in the case business in this area. We had a Ford dealer right in Canaan. Of course, we had the John Deere dealer. And there was another one, too. He was a, well, I forget just what he was. Anyway, there were 4 dealerships right within 3-4 miles of us. Today, really, we have the John Deere dealership, which is mostly now with small garden type of equipment. And when I talk to some of my friends that live in western New York, they can buy tractors, the same tractor that we would pay X dollars for, they pay X minus dollars for. Veterinarians, veterinary help. We go to Copake, New York. There still is 1 or 2 in Connecticut, really 1 in our area that we have to call on, Dr. Hayden. But, you know, there used to be Dr. Pepe right here in Canaan. There wasn't the business, or they go into the small animal practice. The other offshoot of that is the public's look at us, the impact that we have, the knowledgeability of the public of what goes on a farm. We had an open house on our farm, back a few years now, and people that came and were just simply amazed that, gee, you know, this is what it's all about. You know, years ago, everybody had a grandfather or a father who was on a farm, and they intimately knew what goes on,
Yeah.
what type of work was involved, how much a tractor costs, what a cow does. You mean to say a cow has to calve before she gives milk?
Yeah.
And really, we've had doctors' wives and doctors that have stopped at the farm that don't put the two together.
Yeah, I can believe it.
That a cow has to calve before she gives milk. Now, any farm kid knows that. You
Yep.
know that.
Yep.
And yet, it's one of the... So when we go to our legislators and try to tell them, hey, this is what we need in order to exist, you know, we go to Nancy Johnson or so on and so forth. And Nancy is a real good one, by the way, because she has been out to the farm. She's been to our farm several times. She's interested in learning. But I go to her with one story, and then again, coming back to this business of not working together, another group, agricultural group, will go to her with a little different story, and she, when I go to see her, says, Gene, who am I going to believe?
Yeah.
We seem to fragment ourselves in our pricing policies as well as in some of the policies that we...
Well, in the preservation of farming, which seems to be important, an important issue for New England particularly, as I understood it a few years ago, we had 1 week's supply of food, and it may be diminished now for all I know, 1 week's supply of food in New England if major trucking routes were cut. So at that time there was a lot of talk about alternative forms of agriculture and how would we keep agriculture here. At the same time we have all the development pressures that would eat up the land that we need to produce the food. So you have all of this yin and yang of philosophy, actually. How I know that there is a plan to sell development rights. Do you think that's effective? And if you don't think that's effective, what would you put in its place?
It's effective as far as it's gone, Kathy. In fact, our farm, originally we owned 200 acres. After I leased this farm, 2 years later I purchased the farm that we're at now, which is about 200 acres. And that we own outright. Mr. Wentworth, who owned the adjoining farm, did sell his land into the developmental program, and Ben and Matthew were successful in purchasing the agricultural rights to that additional 200 acres. So it has been an effective program, and that land will now remain in open land, open space, in perpetuity. Unfortunately, the program ran out of money. I think it had some administrative problems in that it took too darn long to finish up a deal. It took years for people to get their money, and sometimes if land was tied up in the state proceedings, people just simply couldn't wait that long. But there are other avenues. There are the land trusts that have stepped in and done some work. Unfortunately, Connecticut's about 3 million acres. Originally, the intent of the program was to try to get 10% of the land, or about 300,000 acres, into the program. Well, they downgraded that to 80 to 100,000 acres would be acceptable, and this would give a base that would help agriculture continue. Of course, as an aside, let me say that just taking and saving the land isn't going to do anything if you can't save the business aspects.
Right, you have to be able to support the business once you're on it.
You have to be able to do that, right. And I think that we're down to where we've got, somewhere around 7,000 or 8,000 acres under the program, which really
is that all?
I don't think it's that much, truly. So that we've got a long ways to go. And of course, right now, with the problems the state has, they're not about to fund.
It's a double-edged sword, though, because the land prices are down now, too. If they only had money, they could buy more land with the development rights.
You said it. But, you know, the realities of life, when people are out of work and...
they're not going to pay to preserve open space.
Right.
It's kind of a round robin, isn't it? You never know quite where to grab into the situation and start moving.
Well, it's like everything else, you have to prioritize, and hopefully we'll come back to where these things will be.
Let me ask you a very
Possible.
tough question. Your two sons have carried on the farm, which is something of an achievement in its own right in this climate. Your land is going to increase in value. We are in a recession now, but it will increase in value. They're going to want the maximum dollar off of it someday for their families. Would they sell it for development, or would they want it forever agricultural?
Well, that's not a tough question. That's a very easy question. Maybe let me go back a little bit and give you kind of a long answer. If I get too long, you holler. Back in 1978, we incorporated the farm into a subchapter S. And my reasons for doing this was twofold. One, to have a vehicle so that taxes were not going to be a great burden. And secondly, to allow Ben and Matthew to buy, not to buy into, but to come into the farm, know where they were. And actually what we did was to distribute shares of stock to them. In fact, right now, between them, they own 90% of the business, not the land. The land we put into a marital trust type of thing. And I own 10%. And I guess I was just holding on to that. I don't know, it makes me feel good to have a little bit of the ownership of it. What are they going to do? That's up to them, really and truly. It'd be very easy for me to sit here and say, no, this land, it's mine, I've done this, I've done that, and in perpetuity it has to. I can't look down the road 5, 10, 20 years. I don't know what's going to happen. And whatever is the right thing to do, I trust that they will make the right decisions. I have confidence. They're both intelligent young men. And that decision has to be theirs. Because the Wentworth farm is in the developmental program anyway. Our farm, I don't know. You say it's going to be worth a lot. Suppose the town of North Canaan does go into some sort of zoning next year. And suppose they do say that this is an agricultural district and industry shall not come in.
Except that agriculture exists in every zone. That's one of the things about agriculture.
It does take some of the value. I mean, you know, when you do district, you do take value. I just don't know what.
I think a bigger problem would be that there would be no zoning, and that there might be a pollution problem that runs down the Wading River that would make farming there not as plausible as it is now, and that would decrease the property as an agricultural unit.
This is a very possible thing, and we're looking at that right now. It's funny how things come back at you. Years ago, the government had a program of supplying superphosphate to the farms very, very cheaply. In fact, it was a very negligible cost, and they said, you take this and you put it in your barn, you put it on top of of your alleys and stuff, and then when you scrape your alleys, it goes into the gutters, and then you put it into manure spreader, and you go and you spread it. We did that for many years, and it was considered the ultimate in the practices. Well, they are now engaged in a Long Island study, the Long Island Sound study, which you may have heard of. And they're looking at pollutants that wash into Long Island Sound. Well, the Housatonic River washes into Long Island Sound. The Blackberry River washes into the Housatonic, and Freund's farm washes into the Blackberry.
Right.
And they have found high levels of superphosphate.
Fred,
now,
we're
Kathy,
pick
what do
this
we
up.
do with this? Who is at fault? What is at risk? Do we continue farming? What's the answer?
Yeah.
Like I've heard quite a few times, the solution to pollution is dilution.
But we're running out of room. We're running out of room to dilute it in, though.
Well, what do we accept? What's not acceptable? What's the best use of land? I think that there was a program or a plan back some years ago called the Flanagan Plan, which said, whatever we need, let's buy it wherever it's the cheapest place to get it. if they're making milk in Europe or they're making milk in Oshkosh or wherever and you can buy it there cheapest, let's do that. Well, I don't quite agree with that because you can have weather conditions, you can have catastrophes, you can have, and as you said before, if we were cut off from the rest of the world, what would our
How long would
supply
we last?
of food be? And locally grown produce, locally raised produce, so on and so forth, I think is of a great advantage. People have better control over it. We certainly have a lot better control of vegetables raised in this country than what comes in from...
And then, at the risk of waxing philosophical here, which is one of my problems, what you were talking about earlier about people just not having any connection with the world in which they lived. I remember the time that I took my nephew out and I was doing a story. It wasn't on a farm, it was just on a piece of property where somebody had animals. She had chickens. Well, I wish I had a picture of Tien's face at the moment that he realized eggs came from chickens. You could see it written all over him that he would never let one of those things pass his lips again. I think it keeps us in time and place.
What part of the chicken did it come from?
Indeed. I think it keeps us in tune with who and what we are and in our place in the planet to have agriculture around us and a sense of dirt under our feet instead of concrete.
It's amazing, as you probably know, Teresa Matthews' wife does quite a job of escorting kids around the farm with their farm market. They've developed a farm tour type thing. There's a lot of folks that stop with their kids, and kids are wonderful. They ask whatever comes into their minds, they pop out the question. But it's amazing to me, you watch those parents, and before you know it, the parents are asking a lot more questions than those kids. In fact, they're pushing the kids to one side. Hey, I got something I want to know, too.
Yeah. It's amazing what people don't know.
But the number of people that really don't understand, supermarket shelves are one thing, but where did this stuff originate from, right?
And then we have got the increasing problem in the area of folks coming in from the Bronx, but who don't want a farm, who don't want the smells of the farm, and who don't want the noise of the tractors and things like that. Let it be green acres, but don't let it be unpleasant in any sense of the word, as if somehow things happen by waving a magic wand. We're going to have to contend with that more and more because the population is going to increase.
Well, what we have to do in those areas, and this is something that the organizations we have, such as Farm Bureau, are instrumental, is make sure that legislation isn't enacted that will make it absolutely impossible. We have to use a little common sense and a little reason. We're all of us living in the same world, and I think that we've all got to be responsible for our actions. I mean, we can't just simply decide to run down the road with a load of sloppy stuff in a spreader and liberally spread it around. We've got to be careful. We've got to be considerate as farmers of the owners next door. On the other hand, people next door have got to realize that there are certain noises, there are certain smells that simply are associated with the farm. They're not bad smells, they're different smells.
You know,
I like to tell kids that come, the first thing a kid will do when it comes to the farm, they'll hold their noses and, and I just love to go to them and say, do you know what you smell like to that cow?
That's a good point.
And they really never stop to think of that they smell also. They're people, they're human.
I grew up on a farm, at least in part, not on a high-tech farm, but on my uncle's farm, which was, he learned to farm from his father, and Uncle Ben never saw any reason to change. When he died, he was still farming like they did in the Civil War, essentially. And I'm kind of glad that happened. I'm glad that my farming experience was on that level because it was a fun place to grow up. I never found the smells of the farm offensive. In fact, a couple of years ago, I wrote a column about going to the farm. And the smells that I associate with the farm were complex, but never unpleasant. And that included cows and manure and new moon hay and old hay and leather and oil and milk. Every one of them's got a very distinctive odor that you can pick out if you're
You're
listening.
not available to milk cows, are you? We need another.
I might be.
But you know, you bring up a point that really is close to my heart, and that's a place to raise kids. A farm is a place to raise kids. I just think that my own children and the kids that I've seen raised on farms do have an appreciation of nature. They know what it is to see a cow calve, to see a cow have problems, and an animal that is no longer productive have to go. They just get an appreciation.
It's a microcosm of life, really.
Very truly.
It's a very tactile world, too. I remember all of the physical sensations of the farm as I knew it then, which was a 1940s, 50s farm. We're talking a long time ago, and it's changed, but it was a tactile experience, and I think so much of what we do with our lives now is once removed, at least, from the physical quality of life. Is an animal in trouble? Is it going to have to die? Going one step further afield, and we'll get back to farming very quickly. We do that with our society now. We put people in different little boxes. One of the things I don't like about housing for the elderly is that they live in an enclave, and noisy little children aren't allowed very long. You might have your grandchildren come to see you, but they're soon gone. We have housing development strictly for single people who don't have to be bothered by families and their pets. What kind of a world is this when we begin to separate out all of the...
It's a very peculiar world, Kathy, and we bumped into it just recently with some friends in Florida, where it's a community of just elderly folks, and the big thing of the day is watching to see who the ambulance is picking up next. Well, and it's not an integrated society at all, and it has evolved down into that. And gosh, that's an awful...
That's a very depressing thing. Better to be annoyed by young people playing and see that there's another end to life, right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Now to go back to farming a little bit. When you came to Canaan and you bought you started farming, you had about how many acres at your disposal on that rented farm?
Okay, on this, the old night farm of the Charlie Hoffman place, there were probably, oh gosh, not that many acres, 25 or 30 acres that were tillable.
And some of the rest was usable as pasture land, or no?
Well, cows had to be hungry, and back in those days, they ate their share of rose bushes and anything else that they could get at. You know, it wasn't quite as nice as it is now.
That's funny.
Now, when we moved on to the farm that we're at now, we had about 100 acres tillable, and then we started renting more land, and also the herd size began to increase. We went from 27 cows as soon as I moved down to the farm to about 40 cows. And then we went to 80 cows. We put an addition on the barn, pretty much stanchion type thing, same as was before.
You were still using stanchions?
We were in stanchions until 1963. And then in 1963, we put on another addition, which gave us a few more cows. In 1967, I had an individual that Fred knows well, Henry Lude, working for me. There were just the two of us milking about 80 cows at that time. And a cow stepped on his foot, and Henry's out of business for a while. He just couldn't milk, and I was milking by myself, and I figured, boy, something's sure got to change. So then we went into the milking parlor and freestall operation, which most folks...
Now, were you using a milking machine prior to going to a milk parlor? Were you doing it by hand?
No, we always used a milk machine, And in fact, we had what they call a pipeline milker, where you'd take the milk from a cow, dump it into this thing, and it would make a circle, a glass pipe, and wind up in the tank, so we didn't have to carry everything.
When did you first start using that?
The pipeline?
Or milking machines, let's put it that
Oh,
way.
milk machines, as I say, we were using even up at the Charlie Hoppin.
Were you?
We didn't milk by hand. Milk machines have been around. The first farm I ever worked at, the guy was just then, and this was about 1937, 38, was just beginning to change from hand milking to milking machines. And this had been going on for a period
So
of
they've been
time.
around a long time.
They've
then.
been around a long time.
Hmm.
Yeah. Then, of course, the milking parlor was the next big improvement, where a cow comes to you at chest level, and you don't have to pick up a heavy pail of milk. The milk goes into a receiver jar automatically, and then gets pumped into.
Have you gone to the computerized feed methods where the high-producing cow with the chip can get to the food and the lower-producing cow can't?
Well, we use both. We use the mixer wagon. We have our cows divided up into 3 different groups: a high group, a low group, and then a heifer group, which is the cows that are just beginning to milk. And each one of them gets their own ration. The higher group gets the exotic ration with more protein and stuff. The lower group a little less, and the heifer group is sort of intermingled in there. And then, as we changed cows from one group to another, we found that cows were losing production. So we did put in one of these systems where those cows, even though they had gone to a lower group, still had access to grain to try to hold up their production.
Well, that leads into the question I was going to ask. How do you determine where a cow should be? Are some cows just always lower producers? Is it a function of age? How do you, and would a better feed push production higher on a lower producing cow?
Well, you feed cows on you challenge them. If they don't meet the challenge, and if they don't produce, the next thing you know, somebody's eating them over at McDonald's here. You have to cull.
Yeah.
You have to be selective if you're going to.
Too bad
like
they can't
anything else,
understand that choice. Huh?
If they did, true, maybe they would
Try a little harder.
Try a little harder. But we lose about 1/3 of our animals every year, and that's through culling because of production. Some cows don't breed back. Some of them have other problems, and so the herd, between 25 and 30% of the herd, changes every year.
Okay. You know, Gene, I think I've run through my level of awareness of farming. Have I missed something that you think we should talk about here that you'd like to have people aware of?
Recorded for posterity.
Something like that.
No, I think we've we can go into all sorts of exotic avenues, but I think we've pretty well covered the mainstay of farming. It's always.
What do you see for the future of it? I mean, are you a pessimist? Do you think it's going to be?
I think people are going to want to eat all the time. I think we've got to change some of the policies that we have, national policies, maybe to make it a little easier. I think we've got to recognize that there are regional differences in this country. There's some areas where right now it's easier to produce food, cheaper to produce food, such as California, western Texas, but that those folks are going to be plagued by problems with enough water for everyone. And if we try to concentrate, get all our production over in that area, and we start paving over these farms here into housing lots and shopping malls, we may rue the day that happens. And I don't think it'll happen. I really feel fairly optimistic that people are going to do the right thing for themselves. And they're going to try to perpetuate a varied sort of business climate so that everybody can exist. If they don't, but as I say, I really feel fairly certain that that's the way it's going to go. Ben and Matthew, right now they're talking about doing something about the barns that we are in now. They've grown like topsy. They're not efficient. We're really grown out of room where we are between Route 44 and the river. Kind of difficult to operate there. And they're thinking ahead to a new facility, completely new barns, which is going to be very expensive. But they're thinking that way. They're so that they've got to be fairly optimistic about it. And I'm fairly optimistic about it also. And I'm with them, you know, as far as that whole endeavor goes.
Well, the thing I've noticed in our business, which of course is a smaller scale business than farming by quite a little bit, but the computerization of work, and you mentioned quite a little bit of electronical management techniques now. That's changed us entirely. I think we're about a third fewer employees now. We're a human production versus an animal production, but I have about a third fewer employees now, and we do the work faster. And that's got to happen for farming too, if it's going to function in this modern age.
Well, no question of that, Kathy. I've been involved with Agway as director since 1979. When I first became involved, we had 10,800 employees. Now we're down to about 6,000 employees. That's a fairly large organization. And it's simply the way you have to do if you're going to survive. I don't know what we do with the people that...
Well, that was what I was trying to figure today. I had to give a talk this morning to some school kids, and I was outlining the reduction in employees. And I said, you realize that's good for the newspaper, but bad for the people. And well, where do they go, and what do they do?
Well, they go into other service industries. They go into things to make people comfortable. Now, somehow, years ago, we were talking, if you remember, about a 24-hour work week being the thing that we were looking at. And actually, that hasn't proved out. People are working just as hard.
Actually, the statistics show that we're working more than we were 30 years ago by about 3.5 hours a week.
Yeah. So but I have a lot of confidence. People are going to want, I think, food produced nearby. They're going to want quality food. We've got to have a lot more understanding between what we do and what people expect, and so on and so forth.
And we have to make the land affordable. It's got to be affordable for non-development prospects. If it's going to be worth a huge amount of money to put a silly, unpleasant little house on, as compared to what it is to put a problematic crop on, you know, it's a temptation, particularly as a man or a woman gets older.
Yes, well, that's a whole...
That's a whole other issue, isn't it?
We can go on that for quite a while.
Well, this has been really good. I think we've got quite a lot of material here that's going to be very valuable for our segment on agriculture and the evolution. What we're doing with this whole series is looking at Canaan as it evolves, not only as it was when people were growing up here, but whither goest thou now? You know? And this is a good deal of whither goest thou.
Canaan is a good area. It's always been a nice area. And in fact, the Black Bear River watershed is a fairly protected area. And, you know, I said we went from 4,900 farms down to a little over 300, a little less than 300. And actually, we're making about the same amount of product. The jack ears up there have expanded tremendously. Someday, if this thing goes through that we're talking about, we'll be expanding again by 2 or 3 times. And what we're doing is we're really and truly getting into much more efficient setups, doing the job much better.
Well, we interviewed Albert Julian not too long ago, and I got some actual figures, which I can't quote right at the moment, as to what they were farming when he was a young man on his father's farm and what they're farming now. Fewer acres, more cows, I think their production was 3 or 4 times what it was then.
Oh, yeah.
And it was really very illustrative. I'd have to go back and look at my notes to actually figure, and fewer employees
Right.
producing that amount of work. Very, very illustrative of what's happening.
Well, one of the measurements we have is milk per man,
Mhm.
output. And we all belong to this Dairy Herd Improvement Association, which you give them a bunch of figures and they come back with, you can't hardly begin to put it all. There's so many figures. It takes good management in order to take advantage of it all. And, of course, milk per man is one of the things. That, and we're, of course, much better as is everyone else.
Well, has to happen. Okay, Fred, we'll let your